International Development Evaluation. This is the first session of the first day. The first session is titled as Assessing COVID-19 Pandemic Responses. As everybody knows, the coronavirus pandemic has reached almost all countries in the world during the past 2 years, and its spread has left governments and people in many countries counting the costs because many governments struggle with the policy measures for lockdown and quarantine to fight against the virus. Despite the effort of governments in many countries, many people are still wondering whether their efforts really worked. So in the first session today, we have two distinguished speakers who will talk about this topic. They are excellent scholars and excellent evaluators, and they just finished new research papers and present to us about how they assess the effectiveness of the government's response against the COVID-19. Okay, the first speaker is Professor Oh, Juhwan Oh from College of Medicine in Seoul National University. Professor Oh is a very famous and very active evaluator and scholar. He is actually a medical doctor as well as a PhD in evaluation science. And he is actively participating in government policymaking and evaluation works. And he has published, tremendous amount of research and evaluation reports every year. And he comes with the new paper titled as Real-World Evidence of Trace Test Isolation and Quarantine Impact on the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Performance. So please welcome him with big applause. Okay, Professor Oh, we have 1 hour for the for your presentation, and maybe I think you can spend like 45 or 15 minutes, and we can have a Q&A session.
Thank you so much. Could you see my slide?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. And I'm going to present real-world evidence of trace, test, isolation, and quarantine impact on COVID-19 pandemic response performances. This is preprint. It means now under review by the peer-reviewed journal, so not published yet, but it is open public status as a preprint. You can freely see the full document in the SSRN. I am presenting this on behalf of my co-authors from the about 20 countries. The theory of changes about this, the COVID-19 pandemic response performance might be explained by this dynamic diagram. This is deductive speculation. So when we have 3 infected persons in the community, then we will see some number of contacted persons from these 3 infected people. According to empirical research, the range of close contact can be diverse. However, it might be around 30, but it is reduced during the lockdown period toward about 5. So let's assume about 30 contacted people per each person. So 3 infected people can contact about 30. Now we let's guess about it as a 33. That 3 persons can be 100 contacts. So some days later, 3 infected people became now more 10 infected people under the spread speed as RT 3.33. So this is very close to Delta variant speed of the transmissions. This RT 3.33 as an assumption. We can see 10 infected people in one cycle later from the 3 infected people. So one cycle more, these 10 people became 33 under the RT 3.33. So that from the 3 infected people, 2 contagion cycle later, it become 33 with about 300 contacts. So now how to reduce these expected new cases by the ordinary contact, ordinary social contact. So some of you may be seeing their famous movie. This is old movie, but now you can access by Netflix or something. The Minority Report. If we knew the future very well by the very good prediction method, we can know the exact person who can be infected later in the near future, so that we can just pick up them and then we can wall up those people only, these 10 people only, by that very special method, which was introduced by Minority Report movie, but we don't have it. So this ideal approach can be done, but impossible. So maybe other way, we can trace all 100% of contact, it's around 100%. Then we can make a wall-off system so that they can be transiently walled off within their home, so that these 100 people who contacted infected people are not contacting any other people. So they are, now we call that quarantine. So we quarantine 100% of contacted. This is ideal, but quite difficult to trace all 100% in these cases. So that then only 10% infected, but no more transmission at all. So RT will become 0. But in the many world, like US and then European countries in 2020, those countries chose lockdown policy. What is lockdown in this scenario? Non-specific wall off. No specific wall off, but non-specific wall off. Everybody stop. Everybody stay at home during some period, such as 2 weeks or 3 weeks. That is theoretical period for transmission, incubation period, and then contagion period. So that if we stay at home for 3 weeks or 4 weeks completely, no one contact each other for that period, then same result. 10 people will be the final one from the 3 infected people, no more transmission. But this method is highly inefficient, very disruptive, and even very destructive. Maybe during this period, some of the unstable casual workers will be having no income, and they can be very difficult to survive while they are safe from the virus, but not safe from the economic difficulties. So that this is not really good method. However, most easy approach. This doesn't need any science, just for simple measure idea. Then if it can be implemented by political way, then it can reduce transmission anyway. But this method need one assumption: everybody can accept huge violation of freedom to move. Maybe no world can accept it, but we knew many worlds accepted it. So we can see a partial system between ideal and 0 system. That's the probably real world quarantines. Some of you may have experienced in Korea and in other world, in other countries. So we can see the 10 3 now here. Some days later, 3 become 10. However, 3 out of 10 within world system, quarantine system, and 7 out of 10 is out of world system, out of quarantine. Let's assume this scenario. We can call that quarantine proportion as a 30%. This 30% means newly infected 10 people from the previous 3 infected people. This amongst these new infected 10 people are coming from quarantine. That is 30%, 3. So that in other words, 10 minus 3, 7, 70% are appearing from out of quarantine. So the rest call it quarantine proportion 30%. This is not perfect, not ideal, but partial. Then one cycle later, then 3 becomes 0 because of the quarantine complete wall of no transmission anymore. However, 7 that is not quarantined. The 7 become 23 by the RT 3.33. So that 30% quarantine proportion can change the expected new infection from the 33 to 10 by reducing 23. That reduced number is 30%. Reducing is 30%. So we can make a better performance quarantine. Now, 60% quarantine proportion. Let's assume that. So that from the 3 original infected people scenario, some days later, one cycle, contagion cycle later, 3 become 10s by the RT 3.33. But 6 is appearing within the wall, so that 6 people has no more transmission anymore. But 4 out of the quarantine wall, then they will transmit more. So that these 4 become 13 by RT 3.33. So that 60% quarantine Q proportion makes 33 expected new infection to be 13. So that reducing 20, so 60% reduction. So the higher proportion, Q quarantine proportion, may be translated into the lowered new cases in the 1 or 2 more cycles. So this theory of change can be summarized like that. The more quarantine of contact per each infected, the less new infections in the near future. So under the assumption of the very low variability around the average number of contacts per each infected. As I mentioned, by the empirical research, this is around 30, but it can be reduced by the reduced contact, intentional reducing of the everyday contact. However, in any way, if everybody have close to the average number of the contact per each, then we can utilize this theory of change by the empirical analysis. So little more assumption as a theory of changes. During this quarantine system management, we are using tracing to find out who to be quarantined. So that during the tracing of the contact from the infected, then we can find out someone. Then we test them so that as a result, many of them will be negative test results and some of them will be positive test results. So that ratio of those negative and positive can be a measurement proxy for eagerness of tracing. So in this case, 23 out of 30, 3 positive cases, so that 23 over 3 are 9. So the negative test result for each positive the cases, in other words, infected person, are 9. So negative test result ratio is 9 here, but more active tracing and testing and to quarantine, then maybe 64 traced person may have 4 positive the cases, so that to find out one more person, one more the true cases, we inevitably need to find out negative but contacted person, so that this inefficient waste of the quarantine, waste of some effort. However, to find out one more person who can be high risk to infect other people, then inevitably we can have much more negative results during this eagerness of tracing. So that in this case, to find out one more, 60% negative result over 4 positive cases. So that this ratio is a negative positive ratio is 15. So previous one is 9, then now 15 is a more active tracing result is in terms of negative positive test ratio. It's artificial, it means, is increased number of NP negative and positive test ratios. So we can summarize it. More negative test ratio for each positive, so negative positive ratio can be translated into less new infections in the near future. So now see the let's see the evaluation results, real world. The first one is association between quarantine population proportion among weekly new cases, which was called as a Q proportion in the theory of changes slide. Then 1 week lag confirmed weekly new cases as a log transformed scale. The data is coming from Korea, and then the timeline is from the October 3 and 9 week 2020 to the week of September 12 to 18, 2021, about 1 year, about 50 weeks. So 50 observation of the Q proportion, quarantine proportion, was the regressed to 1 week lagged confirmed cases. So 1 week in the future in terms of new incidents. So this is the result, the real world. So that as you can see, above 50%, it means like here, but more higher proportion of the Q proportion has a lower incidence in the near future, 1 week. The lower Q proportion, quarantine proportion, is translated into the higher incidence in the 1 week. In 1 week, and the lowest in the observation period is 27 or something. 27% can be translated the highest incidence in the real world data. That this is highly statistically significant, minus 0.098 as a beta coefficient with a 0.001 p-values. So as a reminder, this new infection 4 is coming from the quarantine period, the population, quarantine wall, within quarantine wall, that is 2. So 50% quarantine proportion. The other 50% are out of quarantine, so non-quarantine contact. It means these 2 will be finished, but these 2 will be transmitted more and more to be more infection in the near future. So second result is association between quarantine population per new daily cases. So that how many people are quarantined per 1% of the infection. So that is a measure of the activity, the eagerness of quarantine. And 1 week lag confirm the new daily cases. Similar outcome in the previous slide. So this data is coming from the July 1, 2021 to September 14, 2021. It is about 3 months the data from the 9 most COVID-19 prevalent provinces of out of 17 provinces in South Korea. So 19 province based result. So one group, A group is high vaccination coverage provinces. Then B group is a lower vaccination coverage provinces. above average and lower average. Let's see the lower vaccination provinces. And the light one is higher vaccination provinces. As you can see, lower vaccination province has a higher incidences, while higher vaccination provinces have lower incidence in general. But the same pattern, regardless of this vaccination, the coverage, you can see the higher quarantine population per 1 cases, so that quarantine ratio is higher than 1 week later, the lower incidence per same amount of same population, in this case 1,000 population based incidence, it shows a lower incidence if they have a higher quarantine population ratios. Lower quarantine per case ratio can be translated into higher number of incidents in 1 week. This is same for across different provinces, and this is same across different vaccination provinces. That you can see the general trend of this way and this way. So if we change the outcome from the incidence to the mortality and applying 2 weeks more lag, so that from the 1 week lag from the Q proportion to 3 weeks lag for the deaths. Normally, this case coming from the incidence after having some days, about 10 to 20 days, so that we applied 14 days from the incidence, the diagnosis to death on average, so that if we apply 3 weeks lag, then higher Q proportion, quarantine proportion can be translated into lower population mortality, and then lower proportion of the Q proportion, quarantine proportion per cases, the Q proportion is translated into higher mortality in the community. Then another aspect, the negative test ratio, as I mentioned in the theory of change, then the more negative ratio may be coming from the active tracing, so that kind of productive inefficiency in some sense, so that trace to test negative ratio per cases and association with a new instance in 1 week. Logarithmic transformed data shows the same pattern. So much more negative test ratio per 1 cases is translated into lower incidence in 1 week, but lower negative test ratio, which is representing less eagerness of the active tracing, can be translated into higher incidence in 1 week. So this is highly significant. P-value is 0.001. Then let me show association between log transformed 1 week lagged cumulative deaths and the cumulative cases and negative test result ratio, the world data, the 111 countries in 2020 and 2021. In the global data, we don't have quarantine data, so that I utilize the negative test ratio as a proxy of the quarantine per population, the indicator. As you saw in previous slide, in Korean data, those two are very close to each other. So let's see that. This left side is 2020, and then right side is 2021. Then outcome is cumulative number of deaths per million population. So x-axis is negative test ratio, so that higher negative test ratio proxy for the more eager tracing and quarantine. So that, as you can see, regardless of years, then active negative, higher negative test ratio is translated well into the lower cumulative number of deaths, regardless of year. So every observation point is a country level. So you can see in the Vietnam here, China here, and Thailand, Mongolia here, and Taiwan, country, and this Peru, and then some other countries. The similar pattern across 2 years. And if you change outcome variable into incidence cases, its cumulative number of confirmed cases per million population as a log transformed data, the same pattern. Higher negative test ratio can be translated into lower cumulative number of confirmed cases, regardless of year, 2020 and 2021. The 2021 means what? It's a vaccine available period, but still it's a highly significant, minus 0.31. The p-value is 0.001, lower than that. So that vaccination may help so that current negative test ratios slope is less steep than previous years, but still very effective. If we stratify by the vaccination coverage total, then we still can see the same consistent pattern. So lowest result of the negative test ratio, which again I mentioned as eagerness of the tracing activities, then more active tracing as measured by the negative, higher negative positive test ratios is translated into lower cumulative deaths and the lower cumulative incidence in 2021 in the highest vaccine total, vaccine coverage countries like here, so that they are more lower incidence and lower mortality and more lower incidence, but slope is similar in higher vaccination coverage countries and lower vaccination coverage country. The green is lower, then pink is higher, the blue is middle. So generally all three different vaccination coverage coverage level show consistently negative association. So negative relationship between the higher the negative test ratio and the cumulative incidence or mortality. So we can summarize that theory of change seems to be proved to be closer to the real world evidence that we assumed is really happening in the real world. So more quarantine of the contact per each infected, then it can be translated into less new cases and then less new deaths in 1 week, in 3 weeks. And also the more negative test ratio per each cases as a proxy of the proactiveness of tracing of the contact for quarantine as a sensitivity analysis purpose, then the less infection and mortality in 1 week and then 3 weeks. So that the very vivid result, which is very similar to our theory of change, can be proved by this way. This is quite practically important when we know this result. This is another paper result. However, as you can see, this is the mobility restriction effect. So that in South Korea is the highest mobility restriction effect country in the first phases of the pandemic. First phase is about 6 months, from the February 2020 to 6 months later. But next to 6 months, South Korean mobility restriction effect to reduce more transmission is lowered. Then third phase is much lower, and then statistically almost non-significant. And fourth phase, that's the second half of the 2021, is almost no effect in terms of mobility restriction. Is not really helpful. So the lockdown style measure is not effective to reduce mobility, reduce incidence. So if mobility restriction, like a partial lockdown or full lockdown, is not working well in this recent phases, what should be effective measure? as we saw in the previous slide as a evaluation result in the real world, then traced quarantine through the active test, that is the transmission stopping method as a highly effective way. This quarantine means a small number of population who are at risk to transmit other people are transiently walled up in their home for 10 days or 14 days, while other people can freely to move for doing their everyday socio-economic activities. So that small number of population at high risk can be translated into the high mobility of the large number of population. This is one of the way to keep as effective measures in the society. Then we can go other way, how to make this tracing based quarantine can be much more effective and efficient. Normally we started that contact tracing by manual way. However, manual way cannot be the only solution. Contact tracing completeness comparison with the digital proximity app, like a smartphone based proximity GPS or any other the Bluetooth and any many different way of proximity between infected people and the digital application users. If they are noticed as a close contact from the infected person's the mobility data by the digital way, then they can be self-quarantined by notifying the proximity information. Then that digital proximity application adoption rate may be translated into reduction of the infection transmission. So that, as you can see in one published paper, this is very parallel, so that very additive to each other, so that manual contact tracing, if the contact tracing performance is higher, then reduction of the transmission is higher, while digital proximity application adoption rate is higher, same reduction can be done. So that we can change from the manual contact tracing into the digital tracing once we have anonymous technique very well. So in Korea, there are very good invention for anonymous technique by the many the privacy protection technologies by the mathematical way, so that can be one good alternative for the future. Then another reevaluation result was updated actually yesterday. That is this result. This is a period of the so-called with Corona policy period. That is 2021 November 1 to 2022 recent February 10. So during this about 3 to 4 months, so what happened during this 100 days? This NP test ratio is still well translated into the lower incidence in 1 week. This is robust and consistent over the time, so that previous evaluation result is previous days until the next year, the 2021 September. However, this result is after that from November 1 to this year 2022 February. While we can see the mobility effect is almost no. So decreasing mobility does not necessarily means incidence rate decreasing. So no change at all while we are reducing the mobility. Even while we are increasing mobility, incidence in 1 week is not really changed. Then vaccination. Unfortunately, vaccination effectiveness may have some threshold effect. So after having some the level, then it is translated into lowered transmission. However, until then, that effectiveness is not coming out. So vaccination is not really promising. In another way, we remember this Q proportion based the relationship in the 1 week later incidence. So this is real world data between 27% to about 70% of quarantine proportion. But if we extrapolate that into 20% or 10% or 0%, this 0% means no quarantine at all. So that no quarantine at all means very similar to the European countries and the US. Then if Delta virus is the dominant virus, then new instance in 1 week without any quarantine, it means about 44,000 incidents in a day from the lower confidence interval as 22,000, upper confidence interval 95% confidence interval predict 88,000. So that this is Delta based the expectation. Now Omicron is a dominant one, so that Omicron is about 4 to 5 times more highly transmissible. So that if we multiplying 4 or 5 here, then it means about 200,000 in a day without any quarantine system. So that 200,000 new cases per day is the highest expected the number of cases in a day. So that we already knew 100,000 cases recently, so that we may see 200,000 once we give up the quarantine system. Today, the Korean government gave up the quarantine system, so that you don't do any QR code application during the check-in, so that we will see 200,000 new cases in some in a week, some time, so that maybe first week of March we will see the 200 cases in a day. That is unfortunately that can be translated into about 1,000 or 2,000 severe cases as in a bed. That can be 3-digit number of deaths per day probably. So that's not really pleased news. However, anyway, the Korean government gave up the quarantine system. So as a conclusion, as an evaluation, so that quarantine was very effective measures. And mobility restriction, that's not the main purpose of this evaluation paper. However, as another paper, it showed no effectiveness. Vaccination, partially effective. Then that this paper will be written by another way, as a separate paper. But these 3 different effectiveness of the known measure for reducing transmission is evaluated like this. So evidence, which is evaluation result, evidence-based policy is highly needed to control the pandemic. However, the political regime can choose evidence or not to choose evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oh. This was excellent research. I was deeply impressed, and I got a lot of inspiration and lessons, especially the point that you made out about the ineffectiveness of the mobility restriction that made me totally agree about your argument. And I think many of the audience may have a question or comments. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hands, or you can put down your comments or question in the chatting window. Okay, Professor Kim.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Oh, for the excellent research and nice presentation. I learned a lot from your presentation this evening. I have several questions, but before going there, let me congratulate you for the fine achievements. I found especially admirable the ingenious ways of suggesting, coming up with new indicators to measure intensity of TTIQ components in the TTIQ policy regime. And I have some questions. Two are simple. One, is TTIQ a commonly used name for the policy system? And what is the difference between I and Q, isolation and quarantine? And the third one is, I guess, a more substantive point regarding the ineffectiveness of mobility as a measure to reduce the spread of the infections. And I noticed that you are relying mainly on temporal variations in the outcome and mobility measures, right? And it occurred to me that some factors may have been evolving over time, in addition to the changes in the Y and X variables. For instance, I think about South Korea, where people have been getting more and more impatient about the imposed mobility restriction measures, and people are beginning to defy the government issued orders to keep distances, and these recent changes in people's attitudes and behavior are accompanied by the emergence of the Omicron variant, for example, known to be more infectious, right? So, if you compare 2 time points, before and after the emergence of the new variant, right? People are more mobile now, but people are also facing the threat from the new and more infectious variant, Omicron variant. And something like that, might be confounding the estimation results, showing the ineffectiveness of mobility, and also going back to the theory of change, right? If people are slowing down their mobility, then that's going to lead to reduction in the spread of the viral infections, other things being equal. And I wonder whether you have any intuitive explanation for the pattern you found, the seeming attenuation of the mobility effects, right, over time. Sorry for the too many questions, maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Oh,
Yes.
before you answer to his question, I have one simple, very rudimentary question. Can you specify the difference between the mobility restriction and the quarantine? I understood you were saying that taking the QR code was based on the QR code, following the footsteps of the people. That's the quarantine, right?
Yes.
But restrict the accident entry of the facilities. That's the mobility restriction.
Yes, that's right.
So currently Korean government taking they take the QR code, but they do not follow the footsteps. So that's the difference. Is
Yes,
it correct?
that's right.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
yes, correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much for your interesting questions from Professor Lee and Kim. Let me do one by one. The TTIQ, someone called that TTIQ in the paper, someone called differently. In the initial phases, TTT is the most popular terminology. Test, trace, and then treat. But the treat is very non-specific term. So I was hoping to change that T into isolation and quarantine. And what is the difference between isolation and quarantine? That is a very excellent question. Isolation is defined as the really wall off of the infected people, not to contact others. While quarantine means wall off of the close contact people who are not necessarily infected people yet, but contact to the infected people. So wall off of those people are defined as a quarantine. So basically word of same word of, however, different identifier. Then your third question is very much actually very interesting point. The augmentation and the attenuation of the mobility restriction effect over time, that can be definitely influenced by other factors, other covariate, omitted covariate, such as people's attitude. So attitude of wearing a face mask, that can be one good example. So initial phase, no one really wanted to utilize a face mask completely. However, recent days, everybody utilize a face mask very well. So that will be changing the association between mobility restriction and then incidence. So that while we are doing the analysis in the first phases, then omitted variable such as face covering rate would be very low. So the highly effective, highly associated between mobility and then the incidence. However, in the later time, if we assume completeness of the face covering in terms of the blockage of viral transmission, if we assume that actually mobility cannot be translated, cannot be associated with the incidence in 1 week. So that no association is very much logical if face covering blockade 100% of transmission. So that those omitted variable might be one of the great influence. So that technically speaking, that's the omitted variable bias story. However, in real world story, that's the social learning. So that we learned a lot about how to reduce transmission, but we cannot measure that very well, so that we cannot utilize as a evaluation here so far yet. However, that social learning curve is a curvilinear, not truly linear. At the initial phase is very low. However, nowadays is highly sigmoidally higher, so that now almost everyone is utilizing that. So that social learning curve is the secret of the attenuation of the mobility restriction effect into the incidence reduction. That's the speculation of my interpretations. Thank you so much for asking that. And then Professor Lee's interesting question. Actually, I intentionally utilize a QR code as a post aspect. QR code is utilized for general lockdown style, general mobility restriction to block the entry or hinder the entry of the each closed space something, so that QR code is utilized as one of the way of restriction of the general mobility. However, another aspect is actually the more important one in QR code perspective. Then QR code is designed to be utilized as a trace, so the footstep trace. So one infected people is found out in one store, when one restaurant, then that information, QR code information, can be backtraced into the close contact in the same space and same time period, so that contacted people can be noticed to be quarantined. So that is the purpose of QR code. However, those QR code proposed to be utilized for quarantine is now given up, so that it means the Korean government gave up the quarantine policy, so that we will see the 0% Q proportion result in 1 week. That's the rhetorical announcement from mine. I don't want Korea not utilize evidence, but utilize more non-evidence based general lockdown style mobility restriction keeping, so that still they are keeping no people gathering after 10 p.m. so that no people gathering beyond the 6 person. That's really not truly evidence based. That's very much conjecture based. But they believe that, so that I have no influence on their political decision. However, we already see a lot of no changes by that policy, that restriction of the general gathering or restriction of general meeting or something, or while we are seeing the increasing transmission. Even Omicron is aggravating that transmission, but even before Omicron, still we saw many Delta variant dominant period, we saw many mobility restriction was not really translated into reduced transmissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oh. Yeah, this is the moment when I realized the importance of the evidence-based policymaking. The non-evidence-based policymaking of the Korean government made me really uncomfortable, and it affected my life a lot. So based on the hearing of your presentation, I think that it is possible to produce some kind of index for each countries to assess the comparative performance of the COVID responses of government. So I think that the performance level of each government can be determined by combining how they combine the mobility restriction and quarantine and vaccination. So how they, they properly mix those three measures according to the change of the trends of the mortality and the infection rate of the population. So do you think is that possible to assess the ranking of the government performance? And
yes,
I think it will impact a lot in
yes.
in the international community.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was hoping to have that indicators as a composite indicator or any performance indicator as purposely suggested. Then partially, I was successful to have it, but not completely successful. So that not composite measure, but multiple regression using those three variables: so vaccination, and then mobility restriction, and then this quarantine, proxied by the negative positive test ratio. I utilize these three variables together into one multiple regression model with a different lag period, 1 week for each, then vaccination for 2 weeks. Then I have quite robust result for very meaningful result, consistent in the NP test ratio. It is a proxy for the quarantine policy in many countries. Not all countries, but many countries have very much kind of the optimistic, favorable result. But vaccination in the middle, some country has a good vaccination result. Higher vaccination coverage is translated into lowered incidence, but not all. So some country doesn't have it, like Korea. Then mobility restriction also has similarly, some countries still have some effectiveness in reducing the incidence, but most of country doesn't have it. So that if I grade it, the quarantine is most effective, then mobility restriction is least effective, and then vaccination is in the middle. But those three mixture is, I think, influencing each other in one country, so that composite measure is still very difficult, but I would suggest highly utilizing with quarantine policy with a moderate utilizing of the vaccination policy without really restricted vaccine pass or something like a vaccine completeness assumed policy. Rather than doing that, just for encouraging vaccinated, but not regulate by the vaccine pass, so that with the quarantine increased, that might be increasing the mobility to freely move.
Okay, thank you very much. So anybody else have any other questions? We have 2 minutes left, so maybe we can take just one more question. Okay, maybe.
Just
okay.
curiosity, I have from one of the graphs of Professor Oh, is that there are some regional disparity among many Korean provinces, Seoul, Gyeonggi, and other regions. I see some differences in terms of incidence and quarantine levels. So what makes difference among those regions?
I didn't, maybe that is influenced by omitted variable as well, such as population density, so urbanization. So in other words, interpersonal meeting frequencies and then density for each person, then might be not even across different provinces. So that will be one of the main reasons, but there might be some other reasons.
Actually, we have question came from Miss Isidora Simonovic.
Yes, hi. Just a quick question. It got me really interested that you were talking about how we could probably come up with a model that could be widespread used. I was wondering, when it comes to collecting data and statistics, as someone who is European and coming from a country that went through a full lockdown, and it has compulsory vaccination, and we are all at the booster shots over 50%. However, we still have around 100 deaths per day. Is there some other additional statistics that we could possibly collect that could help us indicate and predict the situation? Because from the case such as Korea, we were not able to learn anything. We went completely different cases, and we didn't learn. Honestly, we didn't learn much. We are still struggling as we were struggling on the beginning, although our health system is completely failing.
Yeah. When you say we, who is we?
I mean, we as a government, and I would say we as European countries mostly.
Oh, what country are you from?
Reduced our quarantine measures to 5 days only.
What country are you from? He's
Serbia.
asking. Serbia. Okay.
Serbia. Yeah. Okay.
Serbia.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm doing research requested from European Development Bank. Then that is requesting like yours request. So I will show the result in the near future. However, today I might be saying like that lockdown as a high level of mobility restriction was something effective in while other measure like quarantine was not done in their country. So the one country like your country probably or other European country, if they don't utilize a quarantine policy at all, then inevitably mobility restriction like lockdown would be effective mostly. However, that if that is not interchanged between quarantine policy, increasing quarantine policy by reducing lockdown, that can be allowing your people can freely move without any sacrifice of safety. However, if you don't do it, still you have no option to be safe, only for recurrent lockdown. that is the only option, while vaccine is not perfect in this stage.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Oh, and all the audiences and all the participants who paid attention and asked questions. Okay, so so the first presentation of the first session is over now, and we will have 30 minutes of break. We will come back at 9 o'clock. So please have a rest and grab a coffee or tea, and then we will see in 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.